Hello and welcome to another edition of the Presidents and Prime Ministers podcast. I'm Iain Dale. Well, today we're going to talk about, I think, one of the most interesting American presidents in recent history, at any rate. It's Lyndon Baines Johnson, and George Osborne, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer. He wrote the chapter in the book, The Presidents, and he's here to talk about LBJ. Now, you have had a long-standing interest in LBJ, haven't you? Why the fascination?
Well, first of all, thanks for asking me to write the chapter, which I did in lockdown. It was one of my lockdown projects.
It was either you or William Hague, and I came to you first, and he was going to be second because I know he's equally fascinated by him.
Well, any time William Hague's your reserve is a good sign. He's an interesting president for someone like me to be fascinated with. I mean, primarily because, of course, he's from the sort of liberal US tradition, and the Conservatives, as a Conservative, are always more traditionally associated with Republicans. But I've always had a great interest in him, as have others like William Hague and Gordon Brown and Michael Howard, sort of political contemporaries of mine, because I think he poses the kind of central political question, which is, when do the ends justify the means? Which is so often the case in politics, either in the most extreme examples of wars and invasions and so on, or in the case of kind of rough and tumble political tactics to get the job done. And Lyndon Johnson is the extreme example of that in the kind of American political sphere, because he's sort of gross in his tactics and verging, we would now say, corrupt. And he's sort of completely Machiavellian. And yet his presidency has these landmark achievements domestically on civil rights. He's the president who gives extends voting in the southern USA to American blacks. He introduces Medicare, Medicaid, the great public health programs that exist in America today. He extends federal support for education in America. So he achieves things which all subsequent Democrat presidents have kind of tried to emulate, including Joe Biden. And yet he does it in the most kind of horrendous way. And so you're forced to kind of ask yourself that question: when do the ends justify the means? And I think in his case, domestically, they do. I say domestically because the other thing that hugely overshadows the Johnson presidency is the Vietnam War, which basically breaks him and arguably kind of breaks America. And I think in an age, we're doing this podcast with the horrific invasion of Ukraine underway. I've been in government when we faced these questions about intervening in Libya, not intervening in Syria. I was a member of parliament when we voted on the Iraq war as an opposition MP. These questions of when do you intervene to defend what you think of as your interests and your values, are the same questions that confronted the Johnson presidency. And we all now say, well, obviously Vietnam was a tragedy. But at the time, they thought they were standing up to communist Russia and communist China, and they were trying to learn the lessons of Munich. And so I think his presidency throws up all of these kind of eternal questions, if you like, in politics.
And you hosted a dinner in Downing Street, didn't you, for Robert Caro, who's written these marvellous biographies, which I have to say, I've got them on my shelves. And I've always thought, I'm not going to start them now. I'm going to wait till I retire, but I hope I don't die before I get to read them, because they are, by all accounts, just the most brilliant books.
So Robert Caro, who's very, very much still with us and still completing his biography of Lyndon Johnson, has written a kind of really used Johnson as a way of writing a story of post-war America. And each volume is many hundreds of pages long, goes into incredible detail of some aspect of Johnson's life. So he is the kind of greatest biographer of our age. I had the opportunity of him coming to Britain. I said, I'll throw a dinner for you in the number 11 dining room, which is a very beautiful room designed by John Soane. And you wouldn't believe, people from the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, the Conservatives, they're all trying to angle for an invite because there weren't that many seats around the table. And we had an absolutely brilliant, brilliant evening. And he's interesting because he's also written a book about the person who sort of built the transport system in New York, which sounds very boring, but it's actually a great book as well, about someone called Robert Moses, and there's about to be a play in London about his life. And again, it's this question of what to get the job done, in politics, to create a public healthcare system, to create an urban transport system for New York. What are you prepared to do? And if you only play by the rules, if you're Mr. Nicey-nicey, you often don't succeed. And I think one thing I learned from my time in politics, I spent half my time as an MP in opposition, half my time in government, and it's really delivering, actually getting things to happen rather than talking about them is the big challenge in a democracy. And it's so easy to kind of write your pamphlet saying this is what the education system should look like. The thing I found fascinating, although lots of people say it's kind of mind-numbingly boring and it's bureaucracy and it's the blob, but the kind of actually delivering is to my mind the great kind of Rubik's cube you have to solve, and Johnson solves it.
With the size of government now, it doesn't really matter whether it's America or here, the size of government, it's much more difficult to pull the levers and get things done than it would have been in the 1960s, either there or here.
Well, Johnson is creating the modern federal US government. I mean, before him, there's not really any federal public support for healthcare or education. And the criticism levelled at the Johnson period is that it sort of sets up a culture of welfare dependency and sort of entraps poor America in these great entitlement programs. And that's the kind of criticism that comes 20, 30 years later in the 1980s and 1990s. I think at the time, however, as you say, he's building on nothing. And he himself, by the way, with the possible exception of Abraham Lincoln, comes from is the poorest person ever to be the president. He grows up in absolute poverty in the hill country of Texas, near Austin, where there's nothing. There aren't paved roads, there's no electricity. Without electricity, people have to do back-breaking work all day, both in the home and in the fields. And I think it's hard. You have to be a pretty harsh person to say, okay, well, this was a terrible expansion of the American state. The truth is, he gives the American state a bit of a heart in the 1960s, just as, by the way, it begins to afford it, because it's become the world's richest country by then, very clearly. And I think, in a mature democracy like Britain, if you come in, let's take the NHS, which is always a very contentious issue. If you come in, the NHS has been around for 70-odd years. It's got over 1 million people working in it. You've got 60-odd million people who depend on it. And you're the health secretary. It's not enough to say, I've got my 3-point plan to replace the NHS. Or you've got to fight for, if you want to make radical change, there is resistance in the system. Some of it is very, producer interest based, and it's very obstructive. If your plan's good enough, you'll get past that. But if you just throw up your hand and say, "Oh, I can't deal with this bureaucracy," then I'm afraid you're in the wrong business. You should go and, go and write a newspaper column. I've done that as well. That's quite easy compared to actually delivering the kind of change. Yeah. And Johnson uses all these methods, having been a great senator and a congressman before that, to do things like no civil rights legislation has passed the US Senate since the US Civil War, despite all the promises of Abraham Lincoln. No legislation has passed till Johnson is Senate Majority Leader. He's the person who gets 2 landmark civil rights acts through the filibusters in the Senate, and gets them onto the statute books. People can talk about it. Look at all the problems Biden's having, kind of getting some of his domestic legislation onto the statute book. Look at Obama's presidency, let alone Trump's. I mean, it's very hard to get things done. And Johnson, by essentially kind of, he has this great aphorism: first rule of politics, you've got to learn to count. He goes through every senator, he works out what every senator wants, maybe completely unconnected with the legislation he's trying to pass, and he kind of ticks them all off. He cajoles them, he bullies them, he threatens them, he flatters them, whatever it takes. And he kind of, it's a bit like anyone who's a fan of The West Wing. He is the guy counts ticks the votes off on the equivalent of the whiteboard back then. And that to me is, a lesson in, it's, as I say, it's not enough to talk about something. Delivering it is a whole order of different magnitude more difficult.
You mentioned his childhood. Let's go into that in a little bit more detail, because in essence, from reading your essay, that really influences his later life and sort of his desire to introduce these really massive reforms so that people in those kind of areas didn't experience the poverty that he did.
Yeah, he grows up in one of the most isolated communities in early 20th century America, which is very, very poor, kind of hard scrub farming in Texas. And he's got absolutely nothing in his life that would suggest he is destined for greatness. And yet, almost from the moment he can speak, he's like, I'm going to be the president. And he goes to, rural schools no one's ever heard of. He goes to a Southwest Texas teachers college for his education. This is not Harvard or Yale or West Point, where people like the Kennedys have been. And it's what's odd about his life is he's incredibly arrogant and presumptuous that he is destined to be in charge. And it really rubs up all his contemporaries whether he's a college student or he's at school or when he becomes a kind of junior congressional aide, and then everyone, he definitely puts people's backs up. And yet there's also a side to him which he doesn't kind of seem to wear on his sleeve much, which is deeply and passionately on the side of the poorest Americans, including black Americans, which of course is very unusual for a white poor American of his background. And he, that's his mission. And when he's the congressman for the area he grew up in, he's the person who delivers the electricity. By the way, in some corrupt deal which he benefits from, so that's a kind of classic question of ends and means. But what does he do? He gets the electricity to the area which otherwise wouldn't have got it. And then, as president, he's always got those people in mind. And that's kind of quite remarkable. And it does seem to be genuine. And he also has, when he passes the civil rights legislation, he stands up in Congress as president, addressing both houses of Congress after Martin Luther King has faced and his demonstrators have faced violence in Selma, Alabama. And he says, we shall overcome. He's like the American president the white American president who uses the words of the great, civil rights anthem. And there's an enormous applause in Congress, and it unlocks years of opposition to civil rights voting legislation, which is going to change the politics and power structures in the South. So that's a kind of another paradox of his life, the kind of arrogance and the swagger, whilst at the same time the apparent lack of any kind of racism, which would have been, expected of someone of his background. And without ever, and although he ends up making many, many millions of dollars in his various sort of corrupt dealings out of television stations and a company called Brown and Root, which eventually ends up as Halliburton, he's still sort of fighting for the poor guy, and that's remarkable too.
How did he first become a congressman?
Well, he sets off. He's on course to. Well, he actually spent some time with his parents who are in despair, working on a road on a rock-breaking gang building dirt roads through Texas. Again, it's an extraordinary background for someone who ultimately becomes president. He trains. He goes to a teachers' college. In all of these places, by the way, he becomes like head of the students or head of them. He's kind of already maneuvering for position. He takes a year off when he runs out of money to teach in a very, very poor Mexican-American teaching school on the Mexican border. Then he basically gets a job as a sort of he gets a job as a teacher. But at that crucial moment, a congressman offers him a job as a secretary to him as a kind of congressional aide, basically a junior congressional aide, and he heads to Washington. First time he's left Texas. First time he's, and that is the beginning of his journey. And there's a great sort of story about him. He arrives in those days, these congressional aides were all put up in a kind of hostel, a big hostel. And he knows, with communal bathrooms, he knows no one in Washington at all. And the first night he's there, he takes 4 separate showers. Why? Because every time he has a shower, he meets some other man in the changing room who he can talk to, some other new kid who's turned up. He brushes his teeth 5 times, separate times, because he wants an excuse to stand next to someone at the sinks and get to talk to him. So he's a kind of amazing hustler. But his energy, I think another thing about him, which his unbelievable sort of appetite for work. He worked all hours in every job he did, including president. No one works harder than him. And then from being a congressional aide, he gets to run one of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs in Texas. He becomes then the congressman. And from then he's on his way up. And he wins in 1948 the most corrupt, closest Senate race, I think still in American history, when he beats the kind of favorite, who's a self-styled cowboy called Coke Stevenson. He beats him by around 87 votes or something in the 1948 Texas Senate race, using essentially vote rigging, ballot stuffing from these sort of bosses, these sort of agricultural bosses who controlled the Mexican workforces near the border in Texas. And, he just makes sure that he doesn't close his ballot boxes until the other guys closed all his.
This is something that people in this country can't really get their heads around, can they?
And it's not,
It is, I wouldn't say it's endemic in American politics still, but that's why there were so many suspicions, in a way, about the last election.
Yes, I mean, voting reform and voting and the kind of accuracy of elections is still a contentious issue in America. It was fairly normal, amazingly, in US races in the 60s and 70s, for that kind of thing to happen. I mean, John F. Kennedy narrowly beats Richard Nixon in the 1960 US presidential race. By the way, a race that Johnson wanted to be the presidential candidate, ends up as the vice presidential candidate. And, it is widely thought that the Kennedy family kept the voting booths in the south side of Chicago, the poor area of Chicago, open until they had enough votes to just beat Nixon in that race. And that was so. Johnson is certainly not the only person engaging in this, but it's an amazingly if you want to read a fantastic chapter of Robert Caro's book, read the 1948 Texas Senate race. I mean, it puts any British by-election or whatever to absolute shame in terms of if you think
Tower Hamlets.
It's anything that happens in Britain, you go like, my God, it's on a it's totally different scale in America.
You tell a wonderful anecdote about FDR almost predicting that Lyndon Johnson would be president.
Well, Johnson is he's a sort of liberal nationalist. He's a believer in the strength of the United States, but he's a believer that the United States will only be strong if it looks after its poorest. And his great hero is FDR, the New Dealer from the 1930s. And he's there in the crowds when FDR's inaugurated and does that great, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, inauguration speech. And then when he's become a new member of Congress, Roosevelt does a kind of train ride through Texas and Johnson joins him. And FDR tells his aides afterwards, that boy's going to be president. And the interesting thing about that prediction is that no one from the South has been president since the Civil War. And it was seen as basically impossible for a Southerner to become the president. And one of Johnson's great achievements is he is the first Southerner to become the president. And albeit, of course, through an assassination of Kennedy, but nevertheless, he's the first president to become from the South. And he kind of opens the door to subsequent Southern presidents, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, George Bush 1 and 2. They're Southern presidents. But until Johnson, there hadn't been one. And he kind of knows he has to pass. And, in those days, of course, the Democrat Party were the party of the South. And the party of essentially a kind of racist bloc in the Senate that had stopped any Senate legislation. Abraham Lincoln had been a Republican, and the Republicans were the party of the North, and the party that black Americans voted for. And Johnson does this trade probably to become president. He never quite puts it like this, but he basically trades the South, the white South, for the presidency. He knows that if he's got to show, he shows this as a senator first, that he can deliver civil rights, that he's not a creature of the sort of Southern Democratic white caucus. And it's interesting, and when he subsequently, I'm jumping ahead a bit here, but he gets re-elected with the biggest percentage vote of any American president in history. And the only states he loses are the southern ones. It's the first time they haven't voted Democrat, they vote Republican. It's a presage of everything that was to subsequently come in American politics under Reagan and ultimately Donald Trump. But he that achievement of becoming the southern president, I think, kind of opens the door to what we would now call the New South. Austin, where he's originally the congressman, near where he grows up, is the great booming city of America today. And he's the person who sort of brings the South into mainstream American politics.
We'll come on to his Senate career in a moment, but what did he do during the war? Because again, it's actually almost emblematic of his whole life, what he did during the war, I think.
Well, he's a congressman by this point. And let's be clear, some congressmen have resigned from the Congress or taken a leave of absence and gone to fight in uniform for the United States in the Second World War. He doesn't do that. But he's very conscious that he needs if he wants to be the president, he's going to need a war career. And so he arranges essentially a sort of fact-finding mission to the South Pacific or Southeast Asia, where America is fighting Japan. And he gets himself essentially a seat on a bombing raid over New Guinea. And it was one flight in a plane. And given what he was subsequently described about his war, you would think the guy had been fighting for years and years in the Second World War, flying in planes. This was literally, he just went on one plane once. But the plane was shot at a lot. Other planes that were part of the bombing mission were shot down. His engine was shot. One of his engines was shot. So, and he managed to get himself awarded an American decoration, the Silver Star. So forever after, he was like the war hero, Lyndon Johnson. And I think it's too much to say it was a complete fake, because his life was, albeit not for that long, in danger.
Now, you mentioned the 1948 Senate election, which he won by 87 votes. Within 6 years, he was majority leader. How did he achieve that?
Well, that's an amazing thing, because the Senate until that point had been entirely based on seniority, i.e. the longer you served, the more senior you got, and only the eldest senators, or the ones who have been there longest, got to be chairs of the committees. And he takes a position that he goes after the majority leadership position. So this is for those who kind of follow, modern politics. This is the kind of Mitch McConnell, Harry Reid position. Yeah, very powerful. It wasn't powerful when he got the job. It was actually seen as a bit of a non-job, because the real power lay with the individual committees, foreign affairs, appropriations, and so on. So he takes what's a bit of a, has the potential to be a powerful job, but is not an important job. Persuades essentially a bunch of Southern Democrat senators who he was later to turn on civil rights. He was later to sell them out, but to get where he was, to get where he needed to be, he sort of sucked up to them, and he gets himself put in this position as Senate Majority Leader and transforms the post into the absolute center of power in the Senate. There's a good case. I mean, you asked me to write a book, about him as the president, but you could definitely write a whole chapter about him as the senator. And he, is probably the most powerful senator ever in the history of the United States. So he does that by, basically working out all the tools you can use to get senators to vote for things, whether they have a nice office, whether they go on a foreign assignment, foreign trip they want to go on. he persuades. There's a whole set of senators in the kind of Rocky Mountain states like Colorado, who want dams built, and he trades kind of building dams there for their support on civil rights legislation. He's just incredibly capable, and at essentially working out what each senator needs to get each senator over the line. What's the what do you need to give them? And again, to this day, he's held up as an example of a time when you could make bipartisan politics work in America. You could work with the opposite party.
And he must have done that because, of course, as a Republican president, Eisenhower, and the amount of legislation that was passed in those years, there must have been cooperation along those lines.
Yes, and I think very much so. And I guess I come back to where I started the podcast. He's, all of this maneuvering and these tactics, and he would invite people. By this point, he had a ranch down in Texas. He's very tall, by the way. He's like 6'6", I think he is, and so he's a tall guy. And he would get senators down to stay, and then he would kind of get them in the swimming pool, and get them basically into the deep end where he could stand and they couldn't. And physically, he's a big. He's not just that he's 6 foot tall. He's kind of big, gangly arms and big jug ears, and he sort of stands between them and the shallow end until they could agree on. Did
you ever adopt any such tactics yourself, George?
I mean, that whole kind of for people who love the kind of I mean, politics isn't so much like this anymore, but the kind of the people, the people handling the vote grabbing in the parliament. What we'd say here in Britain, I mean, the whips, that bit of politics.
I've just got this vision of you and Andrew Bridgen in a swimming pool now.
Well, I was a junior whip. That was my first job in politics, which I loved. And I did a fair bit of cajoling myself. Not quite like on Johnson. There's another great story about him, which actually I don't put in the chapter, which is he proposes. He subsequently married someone who was to be with him throughout his life, Lady Bird Johnson, who actually died not that long ago. But the first girl he proposes to says no to him, or her father says no to him, because the father says that Johnson boy's never going to amount to anything. And so she turns him down. And thereafter, when he was president, his presidential helicopter would fly him to his ranch. But he would, instead of landing at the ranch, he'd always get the helicopter to land in the back garden of this girl's house, where she was married to some other local boy. And so the whole house would shake with Marine One landing, just to remind her that, yes, this Johnson did amount to something.
What was his relationship like with Kennedy? Because you've got this wonderful quote here. This was before, I think, the run in 1960, when he was beaten by what he called a little scrawny fellow with rickets. Now, I have no idea whether Kennedy knew that he'd said that or not, but if he had, it's quite difficult to recover that relationship, I would have thought.
Well, Kennedy was very much his junior. He was the junior senator from Massachusetts, and Lyndon Johnson was Senate Majority Leader, so they knew each other very well. And I think Johnson just couldn't quite believe in the primaries that, this much more junior, younger character, who he would say lacked depth and substance or whatever, beat him. For essentially because he was more telegenic and more user-friendly than Johnson. And Johnson's political style belonged to an age, not the television age, and Johnson's, I guess, the first great kind of television president. Kennedy's the first great television president. I have a kind of theory. So Gordon Brown loves the Robert Caro biographies of Lyndon Johnson, and once wrote a book review about it when he was Chancellor Exchequer. Now, I can't help but think that he was beat to the Labour Party nomination by young Tony Blair, the telegenic whippersnapper. I think there's a bit of the Gordon Brown which will be like.
He didn't put that in the review.
I didn't put that in the book review because I can't. Book review is impeccably sourced. This is just this is a George Osborne theory. Having shadowed Gordon Brown for many years when I was shadow John.
But actually, if you go through political history in different countries. There are often circumstances like that. I mean, David Davis, David Cameron, you could almost put like that. Different generations, one more telegenic than the other, accused of not having the depth, etc., etc. There are all sorts of parallels that you can draw, aren't there?
Yeah, so he... it's a kind of classic situation. The older kind of insider beaten by the younger telegenic outsider. Anyway, Kennedy wins. And then interestingly, although it's kind of quite debated in the Kennedy camp, including with his brother, who was to emerge as Johnson's great enemy, Robert Kennedy. They basically put him on the ticket as vice president. And
why did he accept it, though?
Well, they offer it because he can deliver Texas, they think, and they need, it's going to be a tight presidential race, as we were just discussing, against Nixon. But why does Johnson accept it? Well, this is the kind of fascinating thing, and no one can understand, because he's trading the most powerful senator in American history, Senate Majority Leader, a total lock on everything that happens at the federal government level, for vice president, which is famously a job with no power. And his reasoning is really straightforward. He says, well, I've done my maths. 1 in 5 vice presidents become president because the president dies. This is not like like Joe Biden was vice president but then got himself elected president. This is like they die, the president, and the vice president takes over. And he does the maths and he says 1 in 5 is not a bad odds to become president. And by that point, he doesn't really have another route to become president, because he's so sort of badly beaten in the primaries, and Kennedy's going to be there for 8 years, he thinks. And he hates his time as vice president, and he's miserable. He tries, there are various things he tries to get off the ground. Interesting, by the way, in all this, he's the guy who creates NASA. It's an interesting little footnote to Johnson's life. That's as a senator, then as vice president, he builds up NASA. But he, which is why it's in Houston. He basically hates being vice president, and it looks like the Kennedys are going to drop him from the 1964 re-election ticket until Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas.
How realistic do you think that was? Because that did happen a few times in the 19th century, but in modern American politics, even Dan Quayle survived. It hasn't really happened.
There was a
there's
scandal
always speculation.
I didn't go into this so much in your chapter, but Johnson's actually on the verge of being engulfed in a corruption scandal as vice president. So it's quite plausible that might have made him too damaging to take up. And actually, in the subsequent decade, Agnew has to resign as president.
That's true.
President,
so 22nd of November, 1963. Just take us through the events of that day.
Well, I guess you start with Johnson becomes president as a result of what I describe in the book as the most infamous murder in history. And I remember writing those words and thinking, well, maybe there's Julius Caesar. But, Kennedy's assassination is something we've all seen the pictures of. It's in Texas. It's in Johnson's home territory. Johnson's in one of the cars behind. Kennedy is assassinated. And others are hit, like the governor of Texas at the time is also shot. So what Johnson's account of it is fascinating. He's basically pressed to the floor by the Secret Service agent. The car speeds to the hospital, and Parkland Hospital, where him and his wife, wait. They're sort of put in a side room, and they wait for a couple of hours, and then eventually one of Kennedy's aides comes and tells him that the president is dead. And then there's a kind of he's then. If you think of, I write about this a bit in the book. If you think about what we think of as how a president becomes president, the inauguration, the bands, Beyonce singing on the Capitol Hill, all of that, and it's so choreographed, and the oath. Johnson becomes president, sitting in Air Force One, which is much smaller in those days than the current Air Force One, with Kennedy's body in a coffin next to him, with Kennedy's wife Jackie literally covered in blood. With him, they got a local judge to turn up with a Bible, and he takes the oath of office. In their plane is unbelievably hot because they haven't turned the air conditioning on yet to take off, and it's such a sort of And by the way, this is in a country. This is in the early 1960s. This is the time of, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Wall. This is a country deep in the middle of a deeply Cold War, with the whole world watching, with no one knowing whether the assassination had been organized by the Soviet Union, nuclear forces on alert. And in that situation, he, right from the word go, right from the first minute, is not overawed by his responsibilities. He takes control. He exudes authority, control, calmness. There are all these people coming at him with different questions and false reports and speculation about the assassination, and he's just absolutely in charge from the moment he's on.
So he's the very opposite of Kiefer Sutherland in Designated Survivor.
he's very opposite. He's just lots of people freeze in those situations. At every level of authority, he's the opposite, and I think a kind of overlooked part of the Johnson legacy is that he handles that. He kind of reassures America, he reassures the world, he stands down the kind of escalating nuclear escalation that's potential, that is about to happen with the Soviet Union. He helps the nation mourn. And he gives a speech 5 days later to Congress, which kind of catches the national mood. I think because people think of Kennedy as the great communicator, they think of everything I've been saying about Johnson as the backroom dealer. They do, I've forgotten in this podcast also that there are moments, like with his civil rights speech, "We Shall Overcome," like with his speech to Congress after the Kennedy assassination, when he does catch the national mood. And I tell a good story in the book about meeting Lucy Baines Johnson. I met Lucy Baines Johnson, his daughter. She's at school in Washington, and suddenly it is all obviously decades before iPhones and the internet, and kind of word goes around the kind of Catholic, the cathedral, not Catholic, sorry, the National Cathedral Girls' School in Washington, that something's happened, but they don't know what. And then they're all kind of assembled. They're all taken into the assembly. She told this story to me. And they're told that John F. Kennedy has been assassinated. And they're all in shock and they're in tears. And she's in shock and tears. And she hasn't worked out what it means until 2 Secret Service agents walk into the hall in front of all the other girls. So she said the first thing was she was so embarrassed. As you would be as a school kid, and she's let out because she's now the daughter of the president and they want to protect her. So it's an amazing, there have been films made about it and books written, and just those sort of 4 or 5 days of American politics when they deal with the assassination and sort of basically stabilize things. And what's interesting is I can think of some recent examples in British politics where people are elected as continuity candidates but think they're change candidates, and that's a mistake. And he understands that he's an inheritor of he hasn't got the mandate in his own right. He's taken over because his predecessor has died, and he takes on the kind of Kennedy. He says, for Kennedy's sake, let's pass civil rights, let's start the war on poverty that Kennedy had promised, let's deliver a tax cut, which Kennedy had talked about. In other words, he kind of adopts the Kennedy agenda, and that gets him through to the re-election, which about a year later.
And how much did that change then? I mean, the 65 to 69 period, was that pure Johnson,
That's
or
pure
was
Johnson.
that so there wasn't any Kennedy overhang there?
Well, the big overhang is Vietnam.
Yeah.
So when Johnson gets re-elected, as I say, he gets the 61% of the vote. No one's ever done that before, or since. He then launches.
How much was that him, and how much was it the candidate opposite him, Goldwater?
It always helps to be running against someone useless as as the Tories who faced Jeremy Corbyn into elections will tell you. But Goldwater was actually a prototype of the changes coming to the Republican Party. He's a kind of libertarian senator from Arizona. And the Democrats run, if anyone's ever seen that famous ad of the girl picking petals off a daisy, and it turns into the sort of countdown to a nuclear attack. They're basically the Democrats saying this guy Goldwater's a crazy who's going to put us into a nuclear war. So that definitely helps. But Johnson is very popular, and he's achieved real things in the year he's been president. He's passed one of the civil rights laws on segregation in schools and in public places. So he has, there are solid achievements even in that first year as president. When he's re-elected as president, he then embarks on this what's called the Great Society program, which is the Medicare, Medicaid, public education, and all sorts of other things now which we would take for granted, but like federal food safety laws, like the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, federal road safety rules around car designs and seatbelts and stuff like that. So it's it's a kind of big progressive era. Of course, it's a progressive era in other this is also, if you think of Britain in the late 60s, this is when a lot of the legalization of homosexuality, end of the death penalty, the legalization of abortion, divorce, the sort of Roy Jenkins era. So it's I wouldn't say that the Johnson regime is unique in the world in this period, but it's never striking what he achieves.
And particularly when you've got the Vietnam War hanging over everything, because if we take a modern day example, COVID seems to have effectively stalled any reform agenda that our current government has, and yet the Vietnam War didn't stop the reform agenda that Johnson had.
Well, it does in the end, actually. I would disagree with you. I think in the end, Vietnam becomes so all-consuming and expensive that Johnson runs out of money and political capital, real capital and political capital, to do his domestic program. And there's another interesting, and that quite often happens in America with conflicts, that it kind of, the Second World War kind of killed off the New Deal ultimately. I think Johnson inherits from Kennedy a presence in South Vietnam, 16,000 advisors, and he decides to reappoint. The one area where he has not much expertise is foreign affairs. He hires this kind of stellar team, Kennedy's stellar national security team, Bob McNamara, George Bundy, Dean Rusk. These are like the best and the brightest. And there's a kind of rapid escalation of the Vietnam War in those first couple of years of his re-election. And suddenly, within 2 years of him being re-elected as president, you have hundreds of thousands of American soldiers in Vietnam in combat operations, and America doubling down to try and win. And it tears apart the Democrat Party, much like Iraq tore apart the British Labour Party. It, as I say, exhausts the administration. It makes Johnson so unpopular he can't actually visit most places. He ends up, as his visits are to kind of military bases. There's an interesting, since we focused on the Queen recently here in Britain. He's the only president the Queen didn't meet, and that's because he can't really he can't come. Britain has taken what I think is an understudied decision not to join the Vietnam War, even though Australia and other American allies did. And he doesn't come to Britain, but it's an absolute sort of textbook case in how you can get deeper and deeper into a conflict. And for everyone who thinks, we've learned the lessons and we would never repeat such a thing, and yet these really hard dilemmas. Okay, you want to stand up to Russian aggression, but you're not prepared to get involved selling soldiers into the Ukraine. You talk about containing China's ambitions. Well, are you going to put soldiers into Vietnam? Johnson's facing quite similar questions to the kind of questions we would face about aggression from what they would regard as an enemy, and once you're in the conflict, all the dynamics play out. So first of all, they misunderstand what the conflict. They think it's an ideological war against communism on behalf of the free world. They've made the mistake of as they see it in a previous generation, of losing communist China to the communists, which a generation of American politicians were held to account for. They think of Munich and not standing up to Hitler. So they think of it as a kind of stand up against the dictator. But of course, in Vietnam, it's seen as a nationalist struggle against kind of colonial forces, first French, then American. He gets terrible information from the military, which again doesn't particularly surprise me. Keep being told, we're on the verge of winning, Mr. President. Don't quit now. A few more troops, and the British military, which I work with, and they are brilliant and amazing, and they're very good at telling you, for a prime minister, don't get into a war. But once you're in a war, they understandably want to get the job done, and so they're often the last people to say, actually, we've lost.
Was there any moment in his presidency where he seriously considered withdrawing?
Well, he is told to withdraw by his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, and then in a really dramatic moment by Bob McNamara, who's the defense secretary, who's he'd been CEO of Ford Motor Company, and he'd brought kind of modern management techniques to the Department of Defense. In 1967, McNamara says, we've lost and we've got to get out. Johnson, there's a kind of extraordinary moment, which I detail in the chapter, where some reporter says to him, what's at stake in this war, Mr. President? Why are you absolutely so good? And he literally gets out his penis and puts it on the table and says, that's what's at stake. It's an unbelievable story, but it's true. And so in fact, Johnson, he goes around saying, I'm not going to be the first American president who loses a war. And you also get this other dynamic, which, very sadly I saw in Afghanistan and Iraq, where once soldiers start losing their lives and you get injured veterans coming back, you go, well, what about for their sake we can't give up, And so he's sort of stuck in this, and he becomes increasingly paranoid. The guy who had been so calm at the time of the Kennedy assassination starts to believe that kind of communists have infiltrated student campuses, and he has the FBI and the CIA spying on all his political opponents and spying on student groups in America. If you think of where it ends up, and people who know something about America will know that by the late 1960s, the country is deeply divided. There have been race riots in the cities. The college campuses are deeply radicalized. You end up with tragedies like Kent State, where the U.S. soldiers killed students. And then, although this is after Johnson's decided not to rerun, the 1968 Democrat Convention takes place essentially in the middle of a riot in Chicago. So, it's by the end, Vietnam has consumed everything. And Nixon, ironically, is elected to bring the peace and end the war.
How did it get to the point where he said on the 31st of March 1968, I will not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president? Was it just Vietnam, or was it wider than that?
Well, it's a big decision not to seek re-election. I'm trying to think, but in my lifetime, I don't think an American president has not sought re-election when they've had the opportunity. And he'd only served a year after Kennedy's assassination, so he could have served a full second term. He backs off, I think, for three reasons. So one is he's not sure he can win, crucially. Second, he begins to be worried about his health. His doctor started to tell him that he's not well, and he was actually to die 4 years later. And then, crucially, he's going to fight Bobby Kennedy for the nomination. And Bobby Kennedy's coming after him. There's a tragedy there because Bobby Kennedy is himself assassinated after the California primary in that contest. But by that point, Johnson's decided to quit. I think he makes the one big miscalculation he makes is he thinks it'll be easier to deliver peace in Vietnam in the period where he's still president, but he's not running for re-election. But he had another great saying, which is power is where power goes. And the moment he's not running for re-election, all the power disappears. You know, as some British prime ministers will tell you, once you tell everyone you're going to quit,
can't think who you're referring to.
I could actually, there've been two recently, you know, the authority starts to drain away, and Johnson finds that, and he can't deliver the peace. And North Vietnam says, well, this guy's not going to be around.
Yeah.
And so one of the sort of tragedies, personal tragedy for Johnson, is they do the deal with Nixon, just like, in fact, if you remember the Iranians and they did the deal with Reagan, not Carter, in the 79-80 to get the hostages out of Tehran. And so Johnson can't deliver the peace in Vietnam. And essentially, his presidency therefore ends. Is set in defeat, and because his vice president is defeated in the contest against Richard Nixon, it's seen as a defeat of his presidency as well as Hubert Humphrey's candidacy.
And he dies just before his second term would have ended, which is another great what if of history, I guess.
Yeah, he retires to the banks of the Pedernales River in Austin, where he grew up and where he now has his big ranch. There's the Johnson Library in Austin, which I've been to, which is definitely worth a visit. Austin generally, by the way, is definitely if you like things American, Austin's a great city to visit. And yes, and he dies with the kind of sense, you know, by then
He's only 64 as well.
He's only 64. I mean, of course, you know, he's a kind of heavy smoker, drinker, kind of hasn't had a healthy lifestyle at all. He but I wouldn't think that was too unusual of men of that era, actually. I think, you know, a lot of men did die in their 60s. It's more unusual now. But he... and it kind of feels almost, even though it's only 4 years later, it's like the world's moving on.
Yeah.
But and I think Johnson, because of Vietnam, is sort of essentially forgotten, partly because also he's sandwiched between Kennedy and the terrible assassination and Nixon and Watergate. You know, Johnson people forget about, but he actually comes back into fashion when people find it increasingly hard to get things done. That's why he's, you know, Joe Biden cited LBJ as a hero of his and he wanted to emulate. When Barack Obama passed, you know, his Affordable Health Care Act, he cited the Great Society. And I think the Vietnam issues, which we'll remember about containing communist China fundamentally at the time, you know, who knows, they may be coming right back into center stage in global politics.
It's very interesting when you think, can you evaluate Richard Nixon's presidency if you just put Watergate to one side? Can you evaluate LBJ's presidency if you put Vietnam to one side? Well, the answer is no on both counts. But if Vietnam hadn't happened, he would have gone down in history, I guess, as one of the greatest presidents.
Yes, I think so. Certainly, I mean, he's as a complete hero of the liberal left. I think, well, liberal left in an American, you know, sense. He's... I think that's right. I think the problem, again, there are some parallels with the Labour Party and Tony Blair, and, you know, the domestic achievements for the left in Britain could never outweigh the Iraq War.
Yeah.
And it kind of consumed, you know, I saw it tear the left apart here. And I think on a much bigger scale, and the loss of life was sadly even greater, in Vietnam, it kind of destroys the Democrat Party. But Johnson sets up the future of politics for America, because there's been a huge expansion of the federal government, which, for all the talk of the Reagans of this world, and George Bush's and so on, has never been rolled back. No one is going to fight the next presidential election saying they're going to get rid of Medicare or Medicaid. So he expands federal government into all areas of national life. And as I was saying earlier, he unlocks the door to 4 subsequent Southern presidents, and arguably unlocks the kind of economic regeneration of the South. And of course, you know, the civil rights laws he passes, for all the problems that have subsequently happened, you know, the fact that Georgia ends up voting Democrat again, and that a majority, you know, there's a African-American black majority in Georgia, is because Johnson gave them the vote. And so he sets in train a whole set of forces in American politics that still shape it today.
So in the chart of 46 presidents, where do you place him?
Well, all I know is that when you asked me who would I like to write about, I thought Johnson came number 1. So He's not. I don't think he's a sort of great president like FDR, Lincoln. I mean, Lincoln. I know it's a bit trite to say Lincoln, but Lincoln, when you read and study what Lincoln had to deal with, and basically his country falling apart in Civil War. Lincoln's a great president. Washington's a great president for, by the way, deciding he's only going to run for 2 terms. He's going to hand over power peacefully to a successor. FDR, both in the New Deal and the Second World War, and Reagan, my childhood, kind of gave America back its self-confidence. Johnson's not in the kind of first rank, but second rank.
Well, I think there'll be a lot of people who, having read your chapter, will be out to buy the Caro biography as if they haven't bought them already. George, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us on the podcast. Join us again next time. Goodbye.